Welcome back, everybody, for another deep dive. This time, we're going to be taking a look at the parole system, specifically through this really fascinating article from The Appeal about a group of women called the Mississippi Five.
Yeah, the Mississippi Five.
And just for context, for listeners who might not be familiar, The Appeal is a nonprofit news organization, and they focus specifically on criminal justice.
Right.
So they're doing a lot of really interesting reporting on this. And in this case, it's about these 5 women who've all been eligible for parole for years, sometimes decades.
Yes, decades.
But they're still incarcerated. And so the question this article really tries to get into is why? Like, what are the reasons behind this? What are their stories? And what do their experiences tell us about this system as a whole?
Yeah, and they do a really great job of not just like reporting the facts, but also trying to analyze like what are the systemic issues that this case brings to light.
Yeah. So before we get into that, though, why don't we just introduce each of these women briefly? So we have Loretta Pierre, Evelyn Smith, Lisa Crevitt, Alita Kreshik, and Linda Ross. And we'll go into their stories in more detail.
Sure.
But they all have these really unique stories, but they're all kind of bound by this shared experience of being denied parole, even though they seem to have really turned their lives around.
Yeah, and it's interesting, too, because, like, legally, they were all sentenced to life with the possibility of parole after a certain number of years. And that's a really important distinction because it means that it wasn't meant to be like purely punitive, right? Like rehabilitation was part of the equation from the beginning.
Right. Okay, so that kind of sets the stage. Now let's start with Loretta Pierre because The Appeal actually features her voice directly in the piece.
Okay.
So we get to hear from her firsthand. And so Loretta, she was convicted of murder back in 1985.
Okay.
And it was stemming from a shooting that happened during an argument. And she was only 20 years old at the time. And she was 5 months pregnant.
Wow. That's, I mean, that just adds a whole other layer to her story, you know? Like, how does incarceration affect not just the person, but also their family?
It's really heartbreaking to think about because her son, who she was carrying when she went to prison, is now 38 years old.
Wow.
A grown man with 3 daughters of his own. And she's never met any of them.
Wow.
And on top of that, she's been denied parole 14 times.
14 times.
Which is the most of any woman in Mississippi history.
It's just, it makes you wonder what's the disconnect here. Because we always hear about, you know, the goal of rehabilitation.
Right.
But then when it comes to these parole decisions, it seems like that's not really being considered.
It seems like a contradiction, right? Like you're saying it values rehabilitation, but then when it comes to making the decision, it doesn't really.
Exactly. What are the priorities, you know? Is it really about giving people a second chance, or is it about punishment, or what?
Right. Well, and it definitely seems like in Loretta's case, it's more about the punishment. Because while she's been in prison, she has completed over 50 different programs.
Wow.
Like classes, workshops, you name it. So she's clearly, you know, demonstrating a commitment to bettering herself.
Right.
But she still can't get to roll.
It doesn't make sense.
And she mentions this really interesting detail that when she went before the parole board, her file was completely empty.
Empty.
Like no record of her 23 years of working in prison. No letters of support, nothing positive at all.
That's shocking, right? Like, how can you possibly make an informed decision about whether someone is a risk if you're not even looking at the information?
Right. It seems like they were just trying to find reasons to say no, not reasons to say yes.
Yeah.
And she's not the only one. She talks about the other women in the Mississippi Five who've had similar experiences.
So, like, what are some of the things that their cases reveal about the system?
Well, each of them kind of highlights a different challenge or a potential bias in the system, almost like they're caught in this web of legal technicalities and procedural hurdles. And it's just designed to keep them in prison. Even though they've shown that they've rehabilitated.
It's kind of a setup.
Yeah, exactly. So let's talk about Evelyn Smith. She's known as Mama E.
Mama E.
She's 82 years old.
82.
And she's already served 32 years for murder.
Okay.
So she goes before the parole board after 3 decades in prison.
Right.
And her entire hearing lasts 3 minutes.
That's 3 minutes.
3 minutes.
How can you even begin to make a judgment in 3 minutes?
And then they told her to come back in 5 years.
5 years.
5 years.
So is that even a real hearing, or is it just like
a formality?
Yeah.
Like to make it look
like
like
the system is working.
Exactly.
Yeah, and especially considering her age, like the research shows pretty clearly that the older someone gets,
right,
the less likely they are to reoffend. So why are we keeping an 82-year-old woman in prison?
Yeah.
Again, from a public safety standpoint, it just doesn't make sense.
Doesn't make sense at all. And it kind of makes you wonder, too, if they're really considering each case individually, the circumstances of the crime, their age, all of that, or are they just applying this blanket approach where it's just like, oh, this is a serious crime, so
you stay in.
You stay in.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's like they're getting stuck on the past, the crime itself, but they're not looking at the person.
Right.
That's standing in front of them today, who this person has become.
Yeah. It goes against the whole idea of rehabilitation, right? If someone's changed and they've shown remorse and they've taken steps to become a law-abiding citizen, shouldn't that matter more than something they did a long time ago?
Logically, yes.
Yeah.
But it seems like that logic isn't being applied here.
Clearly not.
Yeah. And then we have Lisa Krevitt. She's 59.
Yeah.
And she was convicted of dropping her baby from a bridge while she was experiencing drug-induced psychosis.
Oh.
And this is where it gets really interesting. Her ex-husband, the child's father, is now a judge in the county where she was convicted.
Oh, wow.
So you have to wonder, is there some kind of conflict of interest?
Right. Like, how could there not be some kind of influence?
Yeah. Like, even if he's not directly interfering the fact that he's in that position, just raises all sorts of questions.
Yeah. And it just makes the whole thing seem less transparent. Like, how can we be sure that these decisions are being made fairly?
Right. If there's even a hint of bias.
Yeah.
Then the whole system loses credibility.
Absolutely. It starts to feel like it's not about justice. It's about something else, like who you know or...
what your connections are.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, and this kind of leads us to Anita Krajic's case. She's 65.
Okay.
And she was involved in a crime where her co-defendant, the one who actually shot the victim, was executed.
Oh, wow.
But she's still in prison all these years later.
It seems so arbitrary. Like, how can you execute one person and then keep the other one locked up?
Right. Like, if the goal is rehabilitation, like, shouldn't she at least have a chance to get out? She served her time. She has a clean record while she's been in prison.
So what's the point, And
now on top of that, there are these signs all over the county where she was convicted that are opposing her release.
Wow.
So now we have public opinion being factored into this.
And that's a tough one because on one hand, you want the system to be responsive to the community. But on the other hand...
it shouldn't be about, like, mob justice, right?
Exactly. It should be about the facts, the evidence, whether or not this person is actually a danger to society, not just how people feel.
Right. And it makes you think about, like, what is the purpose of punishment in the first place? Are we just trying to punish people for what they did? Or are we trying to create a safer society?
Right.
By helping them to rehabilitate and reintegrate?
It's a big question.
Yeah. And then you have Linda Ross. She's the fifth woman. She's 62. And she killed a man who attacked her. But while she's been incarcerated, she's been working towards getting a bachelor's degree.
Wow.
She's clearly trying to make something positive out of a bad situation. But it doesn't seem like the parole board is really acknowledging that.
Yeah, it makes you wonder, like, what does it take to convince them that you deserve a second chance? Like, what are they looking for?
And Loretta actually talks about this in the article. She describes the rehab programs in prison as feeling like a sham. Like, it's just a way for them to get funding and make it look like they're doing something.
Right.
But there's no real commitment to actually helping people.
And that's a problem, right? Because if these programs aren't actually effective, then it sets people up to fail. They think they're doing what they're supposed to do.
Right.
But it doesn't matter.
Right. And then they get out and they haven't actually gotten the help they need.
And they end up back in prison.
Right. Exactly. It's like a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Yeah. And it's a waste of everyone's time and money and energy.
Yeah.
And it's just not humane,
Right. And these Mississippi 5 cases really highlight this need for a more humane approach to parole. Like, we need a system that actually focuses on rehabilitation and giving people a fair chance.
Yeah. And it's not about saying that these women didn't do anything wrong. They did. But people can change.
Right.
And we need to judge them based on who they are now, not just on their past.
Right. Exactly.
And I think that's where, like, the idea of restorative justice comes in.
Okay. Tell me more about that.
It's about moving beyond just punishing people and focusing on repairing the harm that was done.
Okay.
And addressing the needs of the victims.
Right.
And giving the offenders a chance to take responsibility for their actions.
Okay.
And make amends. It's a more holistic approach.
Yeah, I mean, and there's a lot of research that shows that these kinds of programs that focus on rehabilitation and reentry actually do reduce recidivism rates.
Right, so they actually work.
So it's not just about being nice to people.
Exactly. It's about making society safer.
Right. It's about what actually works. And the Mississippi 5 cases really show us that what we're doing now isn't working.
Right. And we need to be open to new ideas.
Yeah. And the Mississippi 5 stories, they're really a call to action, to question the way things are.
Yeah.
And to demand a more just system for everyone.
It's about recognizing that even people who have made mistakes deserve dignity and respect and a chance to turn their lives around. And I think that's what we should all be striving for, a system that actually embodies justice and fairness for all.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It really is a tangled web when you start thinking about all the factors that go into these parole decisions. And this question about fairness and bias, it comes up even more in Anita Kreshik's case.
Oh, really? How so?
Well, she's 65 now.
Yeah.
And she was involved in a crime where her co-defendant, the one who actually shot the victim, was executed.
Wow.
But she's still in prison.
It doesn't seem fair, right? Like, if one person's been executed, shouldn't the other person at least have a chance to get out? Especially if they've, been rehabilitated and maintained a good record in prison.
You would think, but to make it even more complicated, there are all these signs posted around the county where she was convicted that are opposing her release.
Oh, wow. So you've got public opinion influencing this.
Right, exactly. And that's a tricky thing because on one hand, you want the system to listen to the community. But on the other hand, it shouldn't just be about mob justice. It should be based on facts and evidence, right?
Exactly. Like, is this person actually a danger to society, or are people just afraid or angry about what happened?
Right.
Yeah.
It makes you think about what punishment is really supposed to be about. Is it about just inflicting suffering for past actions? Or is it about actually trying to make society safer?
Right.
By helping people to rehabilitate and reintegrate?
Yeah, I mean, those are the big questions, aren't they? And these Mississippi 5 cases, they really force us to think about those questions.
Definitely.
Yeah, like, let's take Linda Ross, for example. She's the 5th woman, she's 62, and she killed a man who had attacked her. But since she's been in prison, she's actually been working towards a bachelor's degree.
Wow.
Talk about trying to make something positive out of a horrible situation.
Right.
But it doesn't seem like the parole board really cares.
It makes you wonder if the system is really set up to actually help people, or is it just about punishment?
Yeah, like, what does it actually take to convince a parole board that you deserve a second chance?
And Loretta actually talks about this in the article. She says that the rehab programs in prison feel like a sham. Like, it's just a way for the authorities to get more funding and to make it look like they're doing something. But they don't really care if these programs actually help anyone.
That's just so, I don't know what's the word.
Discouraging?
Yeah, and it makes you wonder, are these programs designed to fail? Like, do they want people to come back to prison?
That's a scary thought.
Yeah, and the thing is, if these programs aren't effective, then it really sets people up to fail. Because they're told that they need to participate in these programs, that it will help them get parole, but then it doesn't actually matter.
So they get out and they haven't actually learned the skills they need to stay out.
Exactly. And then the cycle just continues.
Right.
And nobody wins. The individual doesn't win. Society doesn't win. It's a lose-lose situation.
Yeah. And the Mississippi 5 cases, they really highlight this need for a more humane approach to parole.
Absolutely. We need a system that focuses on rehabilitation, not just punishment. We need to recognize that people can change, and we need to give them a real chance to turn their lives around.
Right, and it's not about condoning what they did, but it's about recognizing that they're not the same person they were 20 or 30 years ago.
Exactly, and that's where restorative justice comes in.
Okay, so remind me what that is again.
Yeah, so restorative justice, it's about going beyond just punishment, and it's more about trying to repair the harm that was done, addressing the needs of the victims, and giving the offenders a chance to take responsibility for what they did.
Okay.
And to try to make amends. It's about seeing crime as something that affects the whole community, not just the individuals involved.
Okay, so it's more of a holistic approach?
Exactly, and there's actually a lot of research that shows that restorative justice programs can be really effective in reducing recidivism.
So it's not just about being nice, it's about what actually works.
Exactly. It's about making communities safer.
Right.
And I think the Mississippi 5 cases really show us that what we're doing now isn't working.
Yeah, they're a real call to action to rethink how we approach parole and the whole criminal justice system, really.
Right. We need to be open to new ideas.
And new approaches.
Yeah, and I think we need to start by recognizing the humanity of people who have committed crimes. They're still people.
Right.
And they deserve to be treated with dignity and respect. Cool. And they deserve a chance to redeem themselves.
Absolutely. These Mississippi 5 cases, they really bring up some big questions about, like, what is justice? And what does it mean to give someone a second chance? I'm also curious, from a more practical standpoint, what can our listeners actually do if they want to help? If they're listening to this and they're like, this is messed up, I want to do something, what would you tell them?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's something I think about a lot, I really believe that even small actions can make a difference, especially when we all work together. So I think the first thing is education. Reading articles like this one from The Appeal, learning more about the criminal justice system and how it works. Because the more you know, the more effective you can be as an advocate.
Knowledge is power, right? But it's not enough to just know about it. We have to actually do something.
Right. Exactly. And there are so many ways to get involved. You can contact your elected officials and tell them that you care about these issues. You can support organizations like The Appeal that are doing amazing work on criminal justice reform. You can even just talk to your friends and family about it. Spread the word and raise awareness, because every little bit helps.
I love that idea of like a ripple effect. Just starting those conversations can really make a difference. But I think some people might feel overwhelmed. Like the system is just so big and powerful. How can I, as one person, actually change anything?
Yeah, I get that. And it's easy to feel discouraged sometimes. But change doesn't happen overnight. It's a long process. It takes time and persistence and a lot of people working together to push for progress. So don't give up. Keep learning, keep speaking out, and keep fighting for what's right.
So it's about the long game, not just like a quick fix.
Exactly. And I think it's inspiring to remember that the Mississippi 5 themselves haven't given up hope. They're still fighting for their freedom, even after all these years. And that's a powerful reminder that we can't give up either.
It's a reminder that we can't just accept things the way they are, especially when it comes to issues of justice and fairness. We have to keep pushing for a better world.
Absolutely. And I think that's a great note to end on. The Mississippi 5 stories, they're a call to action for all of us to really examine our beliefs about justice and punishment and to ask ourselves, what kind of world do we want to live in? A world where people are defined by their worst mistakes? Or a world where everyone has the opportunity to change and grow and contribute to society?
That's a powerful question to leave our listeners with. So to everyone listening, we encourage you to keep learning, keep asking questions, and keep fighting for a more just and compassionate world. And if you want to learn more about the Mississippi 5 and how you can support them, we'll include a link to the Appeal article in the show notes. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.